Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. Today we are going to completely reframe one of the most painful, confusing, and honestly just frustrating phenomenons of the modern dating era. Yep, we're talking about the psychology of ghosting. If you've ever felt the absolute sting of a sudden, unexplained disappearance, well, prepare to have your perspective entirely shifted. We're going to look at the hard science, the deep psychological drivers, and the hidden societal mechanisms that actually make ghosting happen.
Okay, let's dive into this because that visceral pain, that sudden spike of anxiety, and the absolute sting of unexpected silence, it is incredibly real. You know the feeling, you're talking to someone, you're sharing stories, the replies are coming in seconds, and then out of nowhere, total silence. Hours turned into days, and you're just left completely alone with 100 questions buzzing in your head. It's a profoundly disorienting experience that basically upends your reality.
And look, if you've been through this, you are so far from alone. According to a 2018 Psychology Today study, 25% of men and women have been ghosted in a romantic relationship. And, right alongside that, 22% openly admitted to having ghosted someone else. Crazy, right? This just proves how incredibly systemic and common this behavioral pattern has become in our dating app era. It is literally an epidemic of silence.
So, here's our roadmap for today. We'll cover the anatomy of silence, inside the ghoster's mind, the biology of avoidance, the hidden light switch, when silence is necessary, and finally, moving forward with dignity. And I promise you, by the end of this explainer, you are going to systematically get the answers and that profound closure that you were denied by your ghoster.
All right, Section 1, the anatomy of silence, or the fallout of unanswered messages. The psychological fallout from being ghosted actually follows a remarkably predictable and excruciating timeline. Initially, it doesn't even register as ghosting. It just registers as anxiety. We immediately think, oh, I must have said something wrong. Then comes the hurt and disappointment when we realize they just aren't engaging. And this inevitably leads to the absolute most painful phase, the interrogation of our own self-worth. It's like any old wounds about not being good enough just rush to the surface, and we even wonder if we owe them an apology. Eventually, though, this crosses over into anger, at being held hostage emotionally, just trapped in a narrative without an ending. So the crucial point is we absolutely have to uncouple our self-worth from their behavior. When someone ghosts you, it feels like the ultimate, most intense rejection. But the illusion here is thinking, I wasn't enough. The reality, the hard psychological truth, is that ghosting is a behavioral pattern of the person doing it. It exposes their lack of emotional capacity, their lack of empathy, and their sheer inability to handle difficult conversations. It is not a measure of your worth. It's a measure of their limitation.
Section 2. Inside the ghoster's mind. Let's decode the silence.
Now that we've validated your experience, we need to pivot aggressively. We're going to put the ghoster under a clinical microscope and turn what feels like a one-dimensional villain into a psychologically complex human being. I mean, what actually drives someone to just vanish? Well, psychologists point to 6 core drivers. Sometimes they legitimately don't feel safe. Sometimes it's petty revenge by someone emotionally immature. Very often, it's a deep fear of intimacy. Getting close triggers massive anxiety for them. For others, it's just the easiest, most polite-seeming course of action in casual dating. Sometimes they're entirely overwhelmed by their personal lives. And lastly, a simple, paralyzing fear of confrontation. What you'll notice here is that outside of toxic revenge, ghosting is almost always rooted in a severe lack of emotional maturity and an instinct for self-preservation, rather than sheer malice.
And here is a secret that no one tells you. Ghosters don't actually escape scot-free. They experience what psychologists call emotional residue. So by taking the easy way out to avoid immediate guilt, that guilt doesn't actually vanish. It just lingers under the surface as shame and disconnection. Every single time they run, they reinforce the belief that they're a bad communicator, which slowly chips away at their own self-trust and confidence.
It all really comes down to this psychological truth. We repeat what we don't repair. Many ghosters are actually acting out unresolved childhood trauma. They might have experienced high levels of powerlessness or a lack of healthy, attuned attachment from their caregivers growing up. And because they weren't taught how to express their needs or handle vulnerability, they now use detachment and disappearing as a way to seek power and control when they feel internally powerless.
Moving to Section 3, the biology of avoidance, the physical instinct to run.
And this brilliantly illustrates how every human is hardwired with a primitive command to avoid danger. To the ghoster's brain, emotional discomfort registers exactly like an actual physical threat. When expectations rise or a conversation gets heavy, discomfort is detected. Dopamine levels immediately drop, a rush of anxiety spikes, and the evolutionary freeze or flight mechanism is fully activated. The result? Total shutdown and silence. It's an instinctive autopilot.
So, in biological terms, ghosting is simply a dopamine-preserving mechanism. Essentially, when it comes to emotional confrontation, your brain turns into a lazy couch potato. A real, honest conversation requires massive emotional investment and completely drains energy. Avoidance? Well, avoidance requires absolutely nothing. The brain will almost always pick the cheapest, laziest option available to protect itself.
Section 4. The hidden light switch. The mirror technique.
Relationship experts describe a dynamic called the light switch. This is a highly toxic, even emotionally abusive pattern where a ghoster essentially treats you like a switch. When they feel lonely or want attention, they flip the connection on. But the second it becomes inconvenient or requires any real accountability, they flip it off and disappear. They use this to gain all the benefits of connection with absolutely zero commitment.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is that we have to take a hard look at why we sometimes stick around for this. If we are constantly drawn to people who ghost, we might secretly be enjoying the low to zero commitment ourselves. It means low relationship drama, right? It allows us the freedom to live in a fantasy about who they are, rather than dealing with the reality of a real person. Sometimes we participate in this dynamic because it secretly protects our own deep-seated fears of real intimacy and vulnerability.
Of course, we cannot ignore the environment we're swimming in. Modern society, the internet, and dating apps have basically poured gasoline on this fire. They've created a system of infinite options and zero accountability. We live in a culture that treats human connection like a shopping cart, where discarding someone is literally as easy as a swipe. It produces this kind of indifference, training people to value convenience over conscience and treating human beings like dismissible notifications.
Section 5. When silence is necessary. Putting safety first.
Before we wrap up, we have to introduce a vital caveat, because we cannot talk about ghosting without acknowledging that sometimes disappearing is the only right move. If someone is crossing your boundaries, making you feel unsafe, or exhibiting manipulative and abusive behavior, you do not owe them closure. Your nervous system is telling you to get out, and you are completely allowed to protect your peace. Sometimes silence is your absolute non-negotiable boundary. Let's clearly delineate this difference. On the one hand, you have unfair ghosting, disappearing because of a fear of awkwardness or just emotional laziness. This leaves a healthy partner deeply confused and hurt. On the other hand, you have valid ghosting, disappearing due to abuse, manipulation, or feeling fundamentally unsafe. If you are dealing with toxicity, you have full permission to block, ghost, and move on. Disappearing as a form of self-defense is completely valid.
All right, our final section, section 6, moving forward with dignity, reclaiming your power.
So where does this leave us? We understand the psychology, the biology, and the societal systems at play. Now let's transition to actively reclaiming your power and moving forward. I want you to burn this quote into your mind. Ghosting is the loudest quiet message a person can send. It exposes their character. A person who avoids you was already avoiding themselves. A person who runs when things get real simply wasn't built for a deep, secure connection. Their silence is the closure you were looking for.
Let's move to and see how this builds into an action plan for moving forward. Number 1. Stop chasing external closure. They simply cannot give you an answer that will satisfy you. Number 2. Expect honesty and consistent effort early on. If they can't provide it, walk away. Number 3. Always remember, they lack the emotional capacity. You do not lack worth. And number 4. Use this experience to aggressively raise your emotional standards.
I want to leave you with this final, incredibly important thought. When the screen goes dark and the messages stop, you have a choice. Will you let someone's emotionally lazy silence define your ultimate worth? Or will you use their disappearance as the exact catalyst you needed to raise your standards and demand the kind of love, honesty, and connection you actually deserve? The choice is entirely yours. Thanks so much for exploring this with me.